Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Today is Friday, June 27th. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. Lazar, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda. Good to be here.
It is so good to be here, and it's been quite the week, hasn't it, Lazar?
Sure has. Remember when Greta Thunberg was like the headline news in Israel? And think about how long ago that seems, and it's like 2 weeks ago, and how much has happened since then. But plenty to talk about, and the region continues to change drastically.
It is so true. And Lazar, just, I don't know, to give a little window into our real lives, where were you sheltering on all these long nights of multiple sirens during the 12-day Israel-Iran war?
So I'm in Jerusalem, so there's fewer actual sirens. You get like the very intrusive and annoying pre-siren warning, which wakes me up. There's one shelter in the apartment building next to where I live, but the vibes are not great in that shelter. So I started going to the community neighborhood shelter, which is it's bigger and has, it's big and clean and has bathrooms in it. And also the vibes were better. So it's very important when you're sheltering from Iranian missiles to be in the place where you connect with the vibes.
It's so true. And I have to say, I'm very lucky to have a little safe room in my own home. But
Ooh.
waking up a bunch of grouchy teenagers does not make good vibes as well. So we're all pleased that this is behind us, at least for now. But as the dust is, of course, still settling, we're still feeling the aftershocks of the big booms, and that ripples throughout the entire globe. So, Lazar, you and I are going to discuss how the big boom of this 12-day war is causing aftershocks with China, with Russia, with Turkey, and potentially with Saudi Arabia. So all of this and more when we're back.
I often say that if we can only do one thing well, what we need to do is to delight the customer. Our goal is that everything we do falls into the background, and the customer has the experience of, wow, that was easy. And our challenge, and what has made it most interesting along the way, is to keep finding ways to deliver the personal connection and the personalized service in a virtual world. We consistently get feedback, unsolicited, from customers along the lines of, this is the best company that I've ever worked with. At the end of the day, it's the care that each member of the team takes that makes the entire experience what it is.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Lazar Berman. So, Lazar, let's start with China. And I was just reading on CNN, of all places, that Iran's defense minister has reportedly traveled to China on his first trip since the 12-day war. And according to CNN, Aziz Nasirzadeh, please forgive me, Aziz, is one of the 9 defense ministers that is attending this summit, a China and Russia-led regional security grouping to create some kind of alternative international bloc than those backed by the United States. So how does China fit in with Iran and with this 12-day war?
Yeah, so I think what you pointed at as this attempt or this priority of China and other countries like Russia and Iran to undermine the U.S.-led world order, I think, is the kind of overarching goal that we have to view Chinese policy through. That's the lens. That in general, China wants to create a world order in which it has more power, that the U.S. has less. It doesn't want the U.S. to be the world's policeman. It knows that the post-World War II order, in terms of the international institutions, were all built around American/Allied, the victorious sides, even though China was on it. But they were not dominant in creating this. So their priorities are what created the UN and NATO and all sorts of structures and all sorts of trade arrangements through which the world operates and has operated generally peacefully for the last 80 years or so. And it is part of a group of countries, not that they have any real ideological alliance in any sense, but they all share this goal of undermining the regional U.S.-led order. So I think we have to understand that. Now, when it comes to that China-U.S. rivalry, China is stuff that has been in the news. China is very aware that American leaders and the American public are increasingly vocal about the threat that China poses. So there's first of all the military threat, which probably has the second most capable military in the world. We always thought it was Russia, and then we saw how poorly Russia performed against kind of a mid-level military like Ukraine. And we understand that even though China has not been tested militarily in a long time, that technologically and their size and the fact that any war would be fought, close to their home turf, that is the near peer competitor threat that the U.S. is basing its posture around. It's no longer the Middle Eastern terrorist group. So that's number one. Number two, and this has really been something that Donald Trump drove to the fore, and the Democrats have really had no choice but to join him there, because Biden was also vocal about this, is the economic rivalry and the fact that China controls key supply chains for everything from medicine in the U.S. that we found out during COVID, to even the material that makes America's own intercontinental ballistic missiles fly. So that is certainly something that the U.S. has woken up to. Now, China realizes that it is better off when you have a distracted U.S., when the U.S. is not able to focus on the rivalry with China. U.S. leaders since Obama have been talking about this pivot to the Far East. A pivot from where? From the Middle East. That means materiel, aircraft carriers, troops, all that gets moved from the Middle East toward the Far East. And that is something that obviously worries China. Now, since the bulk of the U.S. defense diplomatic corps has kind of grown up when the Middle East was the main issue, whether it was Iran, whether it was Iraq, Afghanistan, or Iran. That there is somewhat of a bias in the U.S. foreign policy community to kind of find themselves back in the Middle East. But whatever the reason, and you could talk about different reasons, the U.S. is not able to disengage from the Middle East. The Biden administration wanted to, right? And then you had Iran nuclear program, and you had the Gaza war, and you had Syria, and you had a whole number of crises that the U.S. just could not ignore, and they kept getting dragged back into very active involvement that even dominated much of the foreign policy agenda of the United States. Now, Trump is very similar to that as well. He campaigned on no more Middle Eastern wars, getting out of the Middle East, wanted to withdraw American troops. And again, he also wanted to focus on China. But this Iran, so that's bad for China. This Iran fight with Israel and this Iran nuclear issue, it's something that Trump wants to kind of wrap up, put in a box so he could not be dragged into the Middle East, and so he could focus on the China issue. So when the U.S. has to be focused on the Middle East and not China, China likes that. And you could even point at you can actually see where this happens on the ground or on the sea. Over the past year, you've had 4 separate aircraft carrier groups that have been transferred from either the Indian Ocean or the Pacific Ocean to the Middle East since October 7th, right? So last August we had the Abraham Lincoln. No, July it started with the Roosevelt, and then August we had the Lincoln. In March it was the Harry S. Truman, and a lot of that was the Houthi problem. And now, because ahead of this fight with Iran, we had the Nimitz, which came from the Far East. So you're actually seeing the transfer of America's most potent weapon on the sea, which is these carrier strike groups, which are being moved back to the Middle East because that's what they have to deal with. So that is certainly something that Russia China wants to see. China does not have any military power in the Middle East, and it understands that it's not something that it makes sense for it to build. It does have a lot of economic interest in the Middle East. Um, Now, one of its most important economic ties with the Middle East is its energy, the energy supply. 90% of Iran's oil that it sells now, so it's heavily sanctioned, goes to China. And there's different ways that it do that. These kind of dark fleets that, oil can leave on a tanker from Iran and then get transferred in all sorts of intermediate ports, on intermediate ships or unmarked ships, and then ultimately it finds its way into the Chinese market, and that's very important for China. Now, China intentionally tries to diversify its energy, but it accounts for something like 16-20% of China's energy, which is obviously very important. If you take that off the market, it would be a huge blow to China. So during the war, there was threats about closing the Strait of Hormuz, which is the strait that leads from the oil-rich Persian Gulf into the Indian Ocean, and then tankers can go to China. China was very vocal about the danger of that happening. So those are the real things that China cares about. Again, the rivalry with the U.S. and what the implications of the Middle East are on that, and the economic implications, primarily its oil supply, which Iran is a serious player in.
So it sounds like it's a bit of a push pull. What you're saying right now is that China is very happy when the US is distracted. Iran, this 12-day war just served as a great distraction for the US, but China is even happier if the distraction is somewhere else in the Middle East, because the war, of course, put its energy source in jeopardy.
Yeah, and China generally, since it's trying to expand its economic reach and influence, likes stability, and also culturally, that's something it likes to see in its foreign policy. This balance. So this is certainly not something that contributes to it. So the fact that the U.S. attention is in the Middle East and that the war seems to be wrapped up for now, and the oil can flow again, and you even had Trump talking about, the Chinese can buy Iranian oil again, which is a strange comment. All of that is good for China, and that's the stuff that those are the things that they've been focused on.
And so the summit that I described at the beginning of our discussion about China is another way to have some kind of safety, a drawer plan, as they say in Hebrew, to take out when there is some kind of strife in the region. And China is very interested in unbalancing the U.S. from being this global player.
Yeah, I mean, I assume you're talking. I didn't, read about this particular meeting. I assume it's the BRICS format, which kind of brings together the the powers of the world that are looking for some sort of alternative to U.S. power. So you have, Russia, India fits in there, China, South Africa, Brazil, and then some other countries go along with that as well. But they have been trying unsuccessfully to create a balance to the U.S. Western power base, so far unsuccessfully, not least of all because of significant differences between the different players there.
Okay, so let's turn to Russia. And, as you were speaking about China, I couldn't help but think about, Hollywood and who have been the big baddies in the Hollywood movies of our generation. I'm a bit older than you are. Of course, there was the Russian threat, and then the Middle Eastern threat, and then the Chinese threat. All of these have been the big, villains of the Hollywood movies. But I think more than anyone else, it's always Russian. And what we're seeing right now, at least after this war with Iran, is that the Russian military might not just be as threatening as we have been raised to believe, because of course we saw that Israel's Air Force took to the skies and basically evaded the Russian military tech very quickly. Did that surprise you, Lazar?
No, I mean, it's been clear to me, and we've talked about this as well, that Israel is just so much more capable than the Russian military, especially in the Middle East. There was the Syrian issue where you had Russian military presence there, and that was something that seemed to dictate much of what Israel said about the Ukraine war. And I always said, what are we afraid of the Russians for? Even in the Cold War, when the Russians were much more powerful and we were much less powerful, we were not afraid to take on the Russians and to kill a lot of Russians. Certainly, the Ukraine war and the way that it's gone has really shown a spotlight on that disparity even more. And there was a great, I think it was a Wall Street Journal piece shortly after the outbreak of this war with Israel and Iran, where they were saying that Israel, within a couple days, achieved air superiority over Iran far away. And that is something that the Russians have still not been able to do in 3 years of fighting in Ukraine, which is incredible, right? Russian pilots don't fly over Ukraine. They use drones and they use ballistic missiles. That's it. So their inability to even assert control over any of Ukraine's skies is stunning, and I think that is another indication of how militarily it's like a mid-level power in terms of what it can do. It's a big military. It's obviously nuclear armed, and it has put a lot of effort into modernizing its military, but it's really underperforming, especially in the Middle East. It really is not a military factor in the Middle East.
Okay, so that's just one element of the Iranian and the Russian relationship. What else could be affected since this war?
All right, so let's talk about how Russia sees the region. First of all, it does not see Israel as hostile, as an enemy. It's probably, with Hungary, but maybe even more so, the most friendly Western country that Russia has. Russia certainly doesn't see it as an enemy in any way, and Putin himself has long-standing and deep connections with a lot of Israeli political figures, and that is something that was not broken by the Ukraine war itself. That Israel maintained open channels with Russia, even though they rhetorically were supporting Ukraine. Now, we know that Russia and Iran have steadily been expanding their defense relationship. Say in January, they signed the strategic partnership, and we'll talk about that in a minute. That really was important about a year and a half ago, when it was the bulk of Russia's, top-level drones were coming from Iran, the Shahid drones. And that's when Russia really, was really relying on Iran for its military support during the war, which is interesting, right? Because Russia's a much bigger country and a much bigger economy. Since then, Russia has started building and producing those Iranian drones on Russian territory. So they're really and improving them. And so they're really much less reliant on Iran now in terms of the military. Now, that strategic partnership, it's not a mutual defense pact. It only says that, besides kind of summing up what already exists between the two countries, it says both countries can't support the other one's enemy during a war. But Russia's, not about to support Israel actively against Iran, and Iran's not about to support you. So it's kind of meaningless in that sense. And I think we saw that Russia was not about to do anything to stop Israel. What did Russia do? It tried to be the mediator. Obviously rhetorically it came out against what Israel was doing, but it had no effect on Israel's war and the US war at all. And I think that really undermines Russia's weakness here. But it tried to be the mediator. And Putin was one of the first people that Netanyahu talked to, and I believe that Putin spoke to Netanyahu before he spoke to the Iranians. So that also undermines, stresses, how that Russia is not 100%, backing Iran. There's also the fact that when you look at it through Russian eyes, why would you want to start putting more into the Iran relationship, right? It's pretty clear that Iran is weak. It has, oil and natural gas, but so does Russia. And you have a side that looks very, very good right now. And you can see that in some Russian media too. Some of them might not like Netanyahu, might not like Israel, but hats off to them. They're basically saying the competence of Israel is exactly what we would have wanted to do. Maybe we should have fought like Israel. If we had Israel's precision and its intelligence, we could have fought against Ukraine with a 2-week air campaign with precision missiles and decapitated the regime. and we would have been in a very different place. Instead, we're we're sending troops to be ground up on Ukrainian soil. So I think there's a lot of respect there, and a recognition that even though Israel looked pretty bad in Russian eyes after October 7th in terms of their competence, that has totally changed, and I think that is also going to affect Russia. So the fact that it doesn't need Iran for that much anymore, and it sees that you do want to balance and keep Israel on side. And also, what's Russia's biggest concern right now is what happens in the Ukraine war, and it's not trying to antagonize Trump. It's trying to make sure that Trump doesn't wash his hands with Russia and say, you know what, I'm going to start backing the Ukrainians now because I can't deal with this Putin. So he doesn't want to come out in any way to antagonize Trump over the Iran strike. So I think put all those things together, and that's why you have a pretty nuanced Russian position. In addition to the fact that this war made oil prices go up, that's of course very good for Russia. Oil prices go up, they can fund their war more, they can do all sorts of things because their economy is so heavily dependent on their fossil fuels.
Okay, let's go to a short break.
With Operation Rising Lion in full force, the moment to act is now. Your investment sends a clear message. Israel is not alone. Go to israelbonds.com or scan the on-screen QR code to invest in Israel bonds now.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. Lazar, let's turn to Turkey. And of course, the relationship between Israel and Turkey is kind of at the bottom right now. Maybe not the very, very bottom of this very deep pit that has been in place since Erdogan came to power. But during the war that just happened, the 12-day Israel-Iran war, we heard reports that Iranians were fleeing to Turkey, of all places. And does that surprise you at all?
No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, the most put together country on Iran's border is Turkey. If I was an Iranian and I want to get away, that's exactly where I would go. And from Turkey, you could continue on to Europe. This war absolutely concerned something that really alarmed the Turks. They have experience over the last 2 decades of what happens when there is chaos and regime change in Iraq and in Syria, and what happens, refugees pour into Turkey, and that becomes a political issue and it becomes a serious problem. So that's something that they're worried about. Another thing they're worried about is terrorism. So the PKK, the Kurdish armed group, is the big enemy, or the big threat that Turkey is always concerned about. That's really dictated a lot of their Syria policy and obviously what they do in Iraq. They've come to an agreement with the PKK, but there's an Iranian branch, the PJAK, which has really not accepted that, and they're concerned that if there's unrest, that they will take advantage of that, and it could cause new security threats inside of Turkey. So there's that as well. They're also afraid that Iran could even attack Turkey. Now, why would they do that? Turkey is part of NATO. There's an important military radar installation in Turkey, and the Iranians blame Turkey for using that to help warn Israel and to help Israel defend itself against incoming Iranian attacks. Turkey says nothing to do with Israel. It only goes to NATO countries. But there is a feeling that if the war really expanded, Turkey could be a target. So the chaos, the refugee thing is absolutely a big one. There's also the economic implications of the energy issue. Turkey imports almost all, or a big portion of its natural gas and oil. I think gets 16% from Iran. So that is also something that it has to think about. Its economic situation is not good. So again, like with China, when you start throwing in these upheavals to their energy supply, that is really something that is not good. On the positive side for Turkey, Iran is something of a rival in the region, and certainly in Syria, right? They're backing opposite sides. So when you see that Israel has been weakening Iranian influence and Iranian proxies across the region, that is good for Turkey, and that gives Turkey an opportunity where it can fill a lot of these vacuums with its own influence. and that is something that I'm sure is seen very positively in Turkey.
It seems like a very nuanced situation because, of course, no country wants a destabilized nation on its border. And in Iran, of course, there's this regime that has an iron fist and oppresses its people. But its people is a variety of different peoples, just like every other country. But perhaps in Iran, you can feel the tensions among different sides a little bit more. You just mentioned this one faction. I think you called it the PIJK. Is that correct?
PJAK, PJAK.
The PJAK faction that is rising up. And obviously, it's not in Turkey's interest to have terrorists on its border. But do you see any kind of signs that Turkey would even be pro regime change for the neighbor on its border?
So I'm sure they would, if there was an alternative ready that would take over, they'd be happy about that. But I would imagine, I'm sure this is the case, there's no opposition ready to take over. So if you don't have this regime, you have chaos. If there was a way to move to a less aggressive and a regime with which they could easily trade and which wasn't arming proxies, of course they would take that. But that's just not the reality right now.
Okay, so let's move on to another kind of whimsical notion, perhaps, and that is the idea of Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords. And we recently heard from Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, who reiterated on Wednesday his belief that additional countries will join the Abraham Accords. Coming off of this war, it seems like, as I said, a bit of a pipe dream. But what are you seeing here, Lazar, especially in terms of the big fish, Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, so the Arab states in general, there was a big concern here that they could be the target, an easy, close-by target, when Iran wants to punish the West and punish America for getting involved. You saw a whisper of it in that Iran targeted an American base inside of Qatar. But there was a fear that, like Iran had done in the past, they would strike Saudi oil facilities and maybe economic centers. So that's a huge fear. They're obviously happy to see Iran reduced and weakened. If you ask them privately, they might not say it, but they're thinking it. Their big enemy, of course, is Iran and the armed Shiite axis. Their goal, when I say they, it's Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, primarily, and then other countries are kind of waiting to see where they go, like Kuwait, Oman. But their general desire right now is to develop economically, to move away from a focus on fossil fuel economies and to be the economic hubs of much of the world. And Saudi Arabia and the UAE are kind of in a rivalry for who's going to get that. So they need stability, but they need the region not to be seen as a region of war. And they need to stay out of conflicts, but they also need there not to be terrorism, and they can't, and they don't want to be seen as instinctively anti-Israel either. Because what better way to show the West that they are with them to the fact that we're open to different religions and we're even able to make peace with Israel. So that is certainly something that is driving Saudi thought, because they're taking a series of major risks on these kind of pie-in-the-sky projects. They need a few of them to hit, and that means they need Western businesses to come, and Western workers, and Western investment. So that is absolutely something that is on their mind. It's important to note that this is the Middle East, but again and again we're seeing that Arab states don't have any power over what happens. Who have we mentioned? Well, Israel's not an Arab state. Iran's not an Arab state. Turkey's not an Arab state. America's not an Arab state. Russia's not. Those are like the big powers in the region in terms of deciding what happens. The Saudis are not driving what happens. They tried to about a decade ago and getting involved in the war in Yemen, but they're not driving now. They're reacting. They're trying to nudge things here and there, but they're definitely not drivers. So in general, it's a era of profound weakness for these Arab economic giants, but they're certainly not able to influence what's happening in the region, and that's dictates what they want. They don't want these wars to break out. They feel like they're not able to defend themselves. They would like the U.S. to be as postured into the region as possible, and with formal defense pacts with them. That's why you have, small countries like Bahrain and Qatar have huge U.S. bases on their soil that they feel like that makes them untouchable. And the Saudis want U.S. investment, the UAE also. So that's what they're looking for right now. They know that they're not powerful. They know that war is bad for them, but they're not going to move. They're definitely not going to take Iran's side here. And then we're asking the question, what does this mean for normalization? I think we're starting. I think there's enough evidence here that we can put the pieces together and saying this is where Trump wants to move to now. He feels like he was able to work with Israel closely to, I don't know if it's solved, but at least put on the shelf this Iranian nuclear issue for a while. He has a lot of credibility in the region once you're willing to use military force. He's done it against the Houthis. Didn't go that well, but against the Iran, it certainly has. And now he can make some demands of Israel, and he can start talking with them about a grand arrangement in the region. So that would mean closing down the Gaza war, and it would mean some statement or some sort of path toward a political horizon with the Palestinians. But then the big prize is normalization with the Saudis, and then possibly Syria, and possibly maybe, let's say, the Kurdish region of Iraq could get some sort of special dispensation where you're allowed to go back and forth, and those are not enemy states. And then, Kuwaitis, Omanis could follow suit as well, maybe Indonesia. So there's a lot of opening here, and my sense is that is what Trump is pivoting to now. We've talked about the fact that he wants that Nobel Prize. He's certainly more deserving of it than a lot of people that have gotten it, for the Abraham Accords, and we'll see what happens with the Iranian nuclear thing. But if he's able to bring about any of these agreements, give him that award for sure.
Well, at least he has your vote, right, Lazar?
Yeah, I wish I was on the committee.
I just want to ask a follow-up question because prior to this war, of course, in New York, there was supposed to have been a conference that was co-hosted by France and Saudi Arabia about this two-state solution to the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. Of course, for Israelis, this is completely out of the question right now. And I just wonder if Saudi Arabia is so set on this Palestinian state that it would be the only way for it to agree to any kind of normalization with Israel at this point.
Yeah, so rhetorically, it's put it out there, so it can't run away from it, but it doesn't mean there has to be a state first. It would probably mean Israeli troops really can't be in much of Gaza at all. Maybe a buffer zone in Philadelphia, and that there has to be some sort of movement that it can point to that, look, we got the Israelis to change their policy. Let's not forget the UAE justified their 2020 peace agreement with Israel on the fact that they prevented annexation in the Jordan Valley. So they would need to show that they're actually bringing some benefit to the Palestinians. It's not that the Saudi royal family cares about the Palestinians. It's the fact that Saudis and much of the Middle East does. So that's the issue there. So Israel will have to figure out how it can do that. When I say Israel, I mean this coalition and Netanyahu. And we've talked about this coalition means Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and some Likud members who would be a problem as well. If we're talking about a grand deal, which would mean the release of the hostages and Saudi peace, could you see the coalition shift toward the center left? I think possibly. I mean, do you think Lapid and Gantz will get in the way of that? They don't like Bibi, and a lot of people don't like Bibi, but I think we should start thinking about it as a possibility if that is what's standing between Israel and the end of the Gaza war and a peace agreement with the Saudis.
Well, Lazar, I've learned my lesson not to bet a coffee on anything with you, so no wagering on this one. But of course, we're going to have to find out. And I have a feeling it'll be many more Friday foci until we hear the result of this.
Very good use of the Latin.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. So, Lazar, thanks so much for speaking with me again today.
Good to be here. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And I guess we'll see everyone next week.
Yep. Shabbat Shalom in the meantime. Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Please join us for another installment next week. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other Friday Focus episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. Until next week, Shalom.